I stood on my porch on May 17th, 2025, and looked west. Heritage Hills at Marysville had been turned into a 1-mile-wide field of splintered lumber, broken sheetrock, and a single overturned Lincoln Navigator with a vanity plate that read LORALEI. My grandfather's 7-row Osage orange and black walnut shelter belt stood between my farmhouse and the destruction. He had planted it in 1937 with a WPA crew. The HOA across the section line had called it ugly in 19 official letters between 1998 and the day before the tornado. Lorelei Brindle had called it worse on Facebook 2 weeks earlier. The EF3 had tracked east-northeast at 150 miles per hour. By the time it reached my western fence line, my grandfather's trees had taken enough wind shear that my barn lost 3 shingles. 2 of her own residents were buried under what used to be her dining room. Tell me below, would you have walked across the section line to help or waited for the news crews? The Vesterholt place sits on a quarter section of flat, tall-grass prairie in central Marshall County, Kansas, 3 miles south of the Nebraska state line and 12 miles north of the town of Marysville. 320 acres, Flint Hills Bluestem and Side Oats Grandma running east toward Big Blue River bottoms. The farmhouse sits on a low rise at the eastern edge of the section. The barn sits 60 yards south of the house. The shelter belt sits along the entire western edge of the home quarter, 7 rows of trees running north to south for a quarter mile, with an Osage orange windward face, 2 rows of black walnut, 2 rows of bur oak, and a leeward face of eastern red cedar. The total wall is approximately 140 feet wide. My grandfather Eric Vesterholt planted that shelter belt in the spring of 1937 with a Works Progress Administration crew under the Federal Prairie States Forestry Project. The crew planted 12,400 trees on Vesterholt acreage that spring. About 280 are still standing today. My grandfather kept the planting log in a leather-bound ledger I still have in the farmhouse roll-top desk. I'm Magnus Vesterholt. I'm 67. I worked 35 years for the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service at the Manhattan Plant Materials Center, 60 miles south of here. My specialty was Great Plains shelter belt design, selecting tree species, modeling wind shear, calibrating row spacing for soil type, and prevailing wind direction. I retired in 2020. I have never been married. I do not have any children of my own. I do, however, have a nephew. My younger brother Ozias died in a grain auger accident in October of 2002 on my family's farm. He was 41 years old. His wife Cordelia left Marshall County 6 months later and has not been heard from since. Their son Holton was 8 years old when his father died, and 9 when his mother left. I raised Holton in this farmhouse for the next 10 years. He went to Marysville High School. He played second base on the baseball team. He learned to drive a 1973 John Deere 4020 tractor before he learned to drive a car. He went to Kansas State for grain science. He graduated in 2017 and took a job with the USDA Federal Grain Inspection Service. He now lives in Manhattan, 30 miles south, and drives up every Sunday for dinner with me and my 15-year-old border collie Buster. In the spring of 1998, a real estate developer broke ground on a 140-home luxury subdivision on the half-section directly west of my home quarter. They paved over the McKinley family farm. They called the development Heritage Hills at Marysville. Brick fronts, white columns, a community pool, a pearl-painted entrance arch on the county road. The first president of the Heritage Hills at Marysville HOA was a woman named Thalia Crockett. She introduced herself to me in the summer of 1998 by way of a polite letter suggesting we coordinate landscape buffering along our shared boundary. I wrote a polite letter back, saying my shelter belt had been buffering the prevailing winds since 1937 and required no coordination. That was the first letter in what would become a 27-year archive of HOA correspondence on the subject of my grandfather's trees. Thalia Crockett served as HOA president from 1998 to 2019. She wrote me, on average, 3 letters per year about the shelter belt. 18 of those letters used the word unkempt. 12 used the word obstructive. 9 used the word eyesore. I kept every letter. I kept them in a brown accordion file in the same roll-top desk where my grandfather's 1937 planting ledger lives. In 2019, Thalia Crockett retired from the HOA presidency. She moved to Mesa, Arizona. Her successor was a 51-year-old woman named Lorelei Brindle. The shelter belt was about to become a very different problem. Lorelei Brindle took over the Heritage Hills at Marysville HOA presidency in June of 2019. She drove a pearl white Lincoln Navigator with a vanity plate that read Loralei. Her husband, Talbert Brindle, owned a regional landscape company in St. Joseph, Missouri, called Heartland View Restoration Services. The company specialized in what their website called view enhancement and unwanted vegetation removal for residential and rural properties across Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri. Lorelei's first letter to me arrived in August of 2019, 6 weeks after she took office. The letter informed me that the Heritage Hills at Marysville HOA Board had voted unanimously to modernize the community's standards regarding adjacent landowner vegetation maintenance. It demanded that I top the western face of my shelter belt by 20 feet to restore community sight lines for the western homeowners. It cited a shared aesthetic easement that, according to her letter, had been adopted by the HOA board the previous May. I wrote her a polite letter back explaining that the shelter belt was on my property, that there was no aesthetic easement of any kind across my land, that the trees were federally registered with the USDA Plant Materials Database as a Prairie States Forestry Project shelter belt, and that no topping would occur. She wrote back 9 days later. The second letter cited a community nuisance abatement provision of Kansas Statute 12-1617, which is a real Kansas statute that addresses municipal nuisance enforcement and has no application to private rural property outside municipal limits. I did not respond. In November of 2019, Lorelei filed a small claims case against me in Marshall County District Court. The case sought $500 in damages for leaf litter encroachment on community common area, allegedly caused by autumn leaf drop from my black walnut row drifting east into the HOA's lawn. I appeared at the small claims hearing on a Tuesday in January of 2020. The judge was a woman named Honorable B. Yarborough, who had served on the Marshall County bench since 1996. She took 35 seconds to issue her ruling. Mr. Vesterholt, leaves blow where the wind takes them. Case dismissed with prejudice. Court costs to the plaintiff. Lorelei was ordered to pay $645 in court costs. She did not appeal. What she did instead, 3 weeks later, was post a 43-paragraph essay to her HOA's closed Facebook group titled Living Next to the Eyesore. The essay described my grandfather's shelter belt as a Depression-era windbreak that has long outlived its purpose. It described me, without naming me, as an aging recluse who maintained the trees out of stubbornness rather than agricultural necessity. A Heritage Hills resident screenshotted the post and slipped it into my mailbox the following morning. I kept it. In 2020, Lorelei filed 2 more small claims cases. Both were dismissed by Judge Yarborough with prejudice within 30 days. Court costs were assessed against the HOA both times. In 2021, Lorelei stopped filing small claims cases and started something new. She began sending Talbert's Heartland View Restoration Services brochures to my mailbox. Glossy, 4-color foldouts. Photographs of before and after rural properties, where Talbert's crews had removed mature shelter belts to open the view for the property owner. The brochures listed sample contract prices for shelter belt removal services. They explained the typical view enhancement value of removing a shelter belt and selling the property at a higher unobstructed view price. The brochures came every 6 weeks for 2.5 years, 41 of them by my count. I put them in the accordion file. In 2022, Lorelei sent Talbert himself to my front gate. Talbert was a man in his late 50s, broad across the shoulders, gold watch, country club tan. He drove a 2021 Ford F450 dually with the Heartland View Restoration Services logo on the door. He parked at the foot of my driveway on a Thursday afternoon in early September. He did not get out of the truck. He waited until I walked down to the mailbox. He rolled down the window. He said, "Mr. Vesterholt, I'd like to make you an offer." I did not say anything. He said, "We can take down the entire western face of your shelter belt for free. We absorb the cost. In exchange, you sign a release allowing us to use the timber for value-added milling. You get cleared sightlines to the west, easier mowing along the fence, and no obligation." I looked at him. I said, "Mr. Brindle, my grandfather planted those trees in 1937. "I am not interested. Please leave my driveway." He smiled. He rolled up the window. He drove away. He came back in January of 2023 with an offer to buy the shelter belt outright for $9,000. In June of 2023 with an offer for $12,000. In November of 2023 with an offer for $16,000. I declined every time. In February of 2024, Lorelei Brindle wrote a letter to the editor of the Marshall County News. The letter was titled, "A Plea for Modern Rural Standards." It ran in the February 16th edition. It did not name me. It described, in 312 carefully chosen words, a Marshall County rural landowner whose neglect of maturing windbreak vegetation has, over decades, created an unsightly visual barrier between his property and the growing residential community on the adjacent quarter section. The letter urged all forward-thinking rural property owners to consult with reputable view restoration professionals about the maintenance and removal of dated shelter belt vegetation. The Marshall County News printed the letter without an editorial response. My nephew Holton drove up from Manhattan the following Sunday. He had read the letter at a Casey's General Store outside Wamego on his way up. He set the paper on the kitchen table beside my coffee. He looked at me. He said, "Uncle Magnus, that's not just an opinion piece, that's an advertisement." I looked at him. He pointed to the second-to-last paragraph. The phrase, "view restoration professionals," had been used 3 times in the letter, with no further definition. He pointed to the masthead of the issue. Talbert Brindle's company had purchased a quarter-page advertisement on page 7 of the same issue. Heartland View Restoration Services, with a phone number, and a list of services that included shelter belt removal as the second largest line item. Lorelei had written a letter to soften the ground for her husband's advertisement. Holton sat at the table for 20 minutes that morning with my old NRCS records and a yellow legal pad. He is a USDA grain inspector by trade, but he has spent enough years around federal compliance work to know what an investigation looks like. He said, "Uncle Magnus, how many other shelter belts has Heartland View Restoration removed in Marshall County in the last 5 years?" I did not know. Holton drove back down to Manhattan that afternoon and made some quiet calls. He came back the following Sunday with a manila folder. He laid it on the kitchen table. He said, "Uncle Magnus, there have been 6 shelter belt removal projects in Marshall County in the last 5 years. Heartland View Restoration was the contractor on every one of them. 5 of the 6 properties subsequently sold within 14 months of the removal. The average sale price was 37% below the regional comparable for properties with intact shelter belts." He flipped a page. The buyer of every one of those properties was a Delaware-registered LLC called Brindle Heartland Holdings. The principal of Brindle Heartland Holdings is, per the Delaware Secretary of State, Talbert Brindle. He flipped another page. In addition to the 6 rural properties, Brindle Heartland Holdings owns a 41-acre parcel adjacent to Heritage Hills at Marysville, on the south side of the development. The parcel is currently zoned agricultural. Talbert's filed Phase 2 expansion proposal with the Marshall County Planning Commission would rezone it to residential and add 70 luxury homes to Heritage Hills. I sat with it. Holton pulled one final document. The original 1998 Heritage Hills at Marysville development permit, Uncle Magnus. It was filed by Talbert Brindle's father, Otway Brindle. Talbert inherited the development from his father in 2014. The HOA was, in effect, Talbert's family business for 27 years before Lorelei ever took the presidency. I stood up. I walked to the kitchen window. I looked west toward the shelter belt. The Osage orange row was in full bud. The black walnut catkins had started to drop. The bur oaks were still bare at the highest crowns. The eastern red cedars were holding their dark green color the way they do through every Kansas winter. The trees did not know anything was wrong. I turned back to Holton. I said, "Bud, who else needs to see this folder?" He said, "The Kansas Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, the Kansas Department of Insurance, the Marshall County Planning Commission, and the editor of the Marshall County News." I told him to start with the Attorney General. Holton called Hyacinth Ostrander at the Kansas AG's office on Monday morning at 9:15. Lorelei Brindle filed her largest fine yet on April 3rd of 2025. A formal lien against my property in Marshall County District Court. The lien sought $142,000 for 27 years of unpaid landscape mitigation fees pursuant to community standards. The lien cited the same fictitious Kansas statute, 12-1617, that the HOA had been citing since 1998. The lien named me as defendant. I read the lien on a Thursday morning at my kitchen table. I drove into Marysville that afternoon and visited my attorney Ezra Crandall at the law office on Center Street. Ezra had been my attorney for 31 years. He was 62. He had grown up on the family farm north of Beatty. His father had been a county sheriff in the 1960s. He read the lien. He laughed for 14 seconds. He said, "Magnus, they are panicking. Holton's calls have already gotten to them. They are filing this lien, knowing it cannot survive a motion to dismiss. They are filing it to scare you into the brochure pile." I told him I had no intention of being scared. He told me he would file a motion to dismiss with sanctions by Friday, and a counterclaim for malicious prosecution and abuse of process by the following Tuesday. That same Friday afternoon, Holton drove up from Manhattan with a thermos of black coffee, a stack of files, and the look of a man who had been on the phone for 9 days straight. He had been talking to the owners of the 6 prior properties Talbert's crews had cleared of shelter belts. 5 of the 6 had agreed to talk to him on the record. The pattern was identical in every case. A Heritage Hills HOA-affiliated person had begun complaining about the property's shelter belt to the owner. Letters, visits, newspaper editorials. The complaints had been low-level but persistent. After 18 to 24 months of complaints, Talbert's Heartland View Restoration Services had appeared with an offer to remove the shelter belt at low cost or no cost. The owners, most of them elderly farmers, several widows, had eventually agreed. The trees had come down. Within 6 to 14 months, a property tax reassessment had occurred. The reassessment had cited the property's new, exposed wind corridor classification as a reason for downward valuation. Property insurance premiums had simultaneously been raised by an average of 217% due to the loss of structural wind mitigation features. Within 18 months of the removal, every one of the 6 properties had been sold to Brindle Heartland Holdings at 30 to 40% below regional comparable. The reassessments had not been fraudulent. They had been technically correct. Without a shelter belt, the properties were genuinely more vulnerable to wind damage and genuinely worth less. The fraud was the systematic engineering of the conditions that caused the devaluation. Talbert had been using the HOA, first under his father Otway's quiet ownership, then under his own, to slowly drive surrounding rural property owners into a position where they would either sell to him voluntarily at distress prices or accept his free shelter belt removal services. Holton had recorded all 5 interviews with the prior owner's consent. He had digital audio. He had signed affidavits. He laid them on my kitchen table. He said, "Uncle Magnus, the Kansas Department of Insurance opened a parallel investigation on Tuesday." I asked him how he knew. He said the senior investigator had called him to thank him. Her name was Calvin Van Sickle. She had been investigating insurance-related real estate fraud in northeast Kansas for 9 years and had been collecting individual complaints about Heartland View restoration since 2020. She had never had enough to build a case. She had it now. I asked Holton if any of the prior owners would testify publicly. He said yes. 2 of them. A widow named Adeline Krause, who was 78 and lived in town now, and a retired farmer named Hugo Lassiter, who was 81 and farmed 40 miles north. Both wanted to come to the County Planning Commission meeting on May 22nd. The meeting was scheduled to consider Talbert's Phase 2 rezoning request for the 41-acre parcel south of Heritage Hills. Holton looked at me. He said, "Uncle Magnus, they are scheduled to vote on the rezoning the same week we have a tornado watch issued for the entire eastern third of Kansas." I checked the National Weather Service Wichita office's forecast. He was right. A strong upper-level trough was tracking across the plains for the week of May 15th. Severe weather risk was elevated. The Storm Prediction Center had Marshall County in a moderate risk zone for May 17th. I sat at the table for a long minute. Outside the window, the shelter belt's leeward eastern red cedars held their dark color against a bright Kansas sky. I said, "Bud, we need to be ready for the May 22nd meeting, regardless of what the weather does." He said, "Already on it." I called Dr. Cyril Yount at the USDA Manhattan Plant Materials Center on Monday morning at 7:15. Cyril had taken over my position when I retired in 2020. He was 48. He had spent 12 years at the Plant Materials Center before that. He had a doctorate in plant ecology from Kansas State and a master's in agricultural engineering. He maintained the Federal Shelter Belt Registry for the entire Great Plains region. I told him what Holton had found. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Magnus, I'm going to pull the registry data. Give me 48 hours. He called me back Wednesday morning at 6:30. He said, "Magnus, the pattern is bigger than Marshall County." I sat down at the kitchen table. He walked me through it. 27 federally registered shelter belts had been removed across northeast Kansas in the last 7 years. All 27 removals had been performed by Heartland View Restoration Services, or one of its 3 subsidiaries. The shelter belts spanned 4 counties: Marshall, Washington, Nemaha, and Pottawatomie. Of the 27 properties, 11 were now owned by Brindle Heartland Holdings LLC. The remaining 16 had been sold to other buyers at distressed prices, but Cyril had pulled the recorded chain of title for each of them. Every single sale had been facilitated by a real estate agent named Twyla Crockett, Thalia Crockett's daughter. Thalia, the original 1998 HOA president, had moved to Mesa, Arizona in 2019, but her daughter Twyla had stayed in Marshall County and become the regional listing agent for distressed shelter belt removed properties. The Brindle scheme had been running for 27 years across the family generation. Cyril pulled one more set of data. The total acreage that Brindle Heartland Holdings now controlled across the 4 counties was approximately 7,400 acres. The total agricultural land value at the time of acquisition had been approximately $18 million. The current development rezoned value, based on Brindle's filed expansion plans across multiple township boards, was approximately $142 million. Talbert Brindle had been systematically engineering the dismantling of 7,000 acres of Kansas shelter belt infrastructure to assemble a future luxury subdivision portfolio worth $124 million above acquisition cost. The conditions that protected Kansas farmsteads from wind damage, 80-year-old planted shelter belts established by the federal government during the Dust Bowl, had been the systematic target. I sat at the table with my own breath sounding loud in my ears. Cyril said one sentence, "Magnus, he has been clear-cutting the federal infrastructure of the Great Plains." I asked him what I should do. He said, "Magnus, I will deliver the complete registry data to the Kansas Attorney General's office by close of business Friday. The federal NRCS regional office in Salina will issue a parallel administrative complaint to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas. This is no longer a Marshall County matter." I told him thank you. I hung up. I looked out the kitchen window at the shelter belt. The Osage orange row was 4 inches taller than it had been when my grandfather planted it in 1937, because the windward face had been pruned every 15 years for new growth. The black walnut row stood roughly 74 feet tall. The bur oaks were 88 feet. The eastern red cedars were 52 feet and holding. 7 rows, 280 trees, 140 feet wide, a quarter-mile long. The wall my grandfather had built was the largest intact shelter belt the Brindle family had so far failed to take down. The County Planning Commission meeting on the rezoning was 8 days away. The Storm Prediction Center had updated their May 17th forecast to high risk. Hyacinth Ostrander at the Kansas Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division opened her formal investigation file at 3 in the afternoon on Wednesday, May 14th. She had been a deputy attorney general for 11 years. She had grown up on a farm outside Concordia. She knew shelter belts. She had played in one as a child. She called me at 3:20. She listened to me for 41 minutes. She said, "Mr. Vesterholt, I want every shelter belt removal owner who is willing to testify in writing in my office by Monday morning. I want all of Dr. Yount's registry data on my desk by Thursday afternoon. I want every fine letter Lorelei Brindle has ever sent you in chronological order by Friday. I will have a formal indictment drafted for the Kansas grand jury by the following Monday." She said one more thing. "Mr. Vesterholt, the May 22nd County Planning Commission meeting on the Phase 2 rezoning. I would like to attend. I would like to issue the indictment at the conclusion of public comment." I told her yes. Calvin Van Sickle, at the Kansas Department of Insurance, opened her parallel administrative action on Thursday morning. She subpoenaed the policy records of 19 shelter belt removed properties across the 4-county region. She subpoenaed the underwriting files at 3 regional insurance companies. She subpoenaed Heartland View Restoration Services contractor licensing records. By Friday, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Kansas had assigned a federal prosecutor named Vasey Penrose to the case. Penrose was 44. He had prosecuted 3 rural land fraud cases in western Kansas between 2019 and 2024. He had won all 3. Penrose called me Friday afternoon at 4. He listened for 20 minutes. He said, "Mr. Vesterholt, this is a federal RICO case. Wire fraud, mail fraud, real estate fraud, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. Federal indictments by the end of June." I thanked him. I sat at the kitchen table that evening with Holton and Buster, my 15-year-old border collie, who slept under the table the way he had since 2010, when Holton was 16, and brought him home from the Marshall County Animal Shelter as a Christmas present. Holton said, "Uncle Magnus, the Marysville National Weather Service Office issued a tornado watch for Sunday afternoon. The Storm Prediction Center has us in a moderate to high-risk zone." I told him we should be ready for the Planning Commission meeting Thursday, regardless of what the weather did between now and then. He said, "Uncle Magnus, the Planning Commission meeting is going to be moot by Monday morning." I asked him what he meant. He said, "If the SPC is right about Sunday, the tornado is going to do half of our argument for us." In the 72 hours between Friday afternoon and Sunday's tornado watch, Lorelei Brindle made 4 serious mistakes. The first arrived Friday at 5 p.m., when Lorelei's attorney filed an emergency civil action in Marshall County District Court, seeking a temporary restraining order against the Kansas Attorney General's investigation. The complaint alleged that Hyacinth Ostrander's pending indictment was politically motivated retaliation against a community leader. Judge B. Yarborough denied the TRO from her chambers at 6:22 Friday evening. She added a brief order noting that civil actions cannot stay state criminal investigations, and admonishing Lorelei's attorney for filing in bad faith. She awarded Ezra Crandall $15,000 in sanctions. The second mistake arrived Saturday morning at 7, when Talbert Brindle's Ford F450 pulled up to my front gate. He had driven down from St. Joseph at 4:30 in the morning. He got out. He walked to the gate. He did not come up the driveway. I walked down with Buster on a long leather lead Holton had braided for me in 2018. Talbert stood with his hands on his hips. He had not slept. His country club tan looked gray. He said, "Magnus, I'll buy out the fines. I'll cancel the lien. I'll have Lorelei issue a written retraction. I'll pull the Phase 2 rezoning application. I'll close down Heartland View Restoration Services. Please, don't testify on Thursday." I looked at him for a long second. I said, "Mr. Brindle, the Kansas Attorney General does not need my testimony. She has the Federal Shelter Belt Registry. She has the property records. She has Calvin Van Sickle's insurance file. She has Adeline Krause and Hugo Lassiter's sworn affidavits. She has your father's 1998 development permit. She has your Delaware LLC filings. You are not negotiating with me. You are watching." He stood at the gate for a long moment. He turned around. He drove away. He did not come back. The third mistake arrived Saturday afternoon at 3:15, when Lorelei Brindle called the Marshall County Sheriff's Office and requested a welfare check on me. She told the dispatcher that I had been hoarding storm preparation supplies in a paranoid manner, and that she was concerned for the well-being of an aging neighbor. The dispatcher relayed the call to Sheriff Bowen Goheen, who had been the sheriff for 15 years, and who had known my brother Ozias since they had attended Beatty High School together in 1979. Sheriff Goheen did not dispatch a deputy. He picked up his cell phone. He called me directly. He said, "Magnus, Lorelei Brindle just called dispatch, trying to get a welfare check on you. I'm not sending anyone. Are you stocked up for tomorrow's weather?" I told him I was. He said, "Good. Stay in your root cellar from 4 onward. I have a bad feeling about this one." He hung up. The fourth mistake came Saturday evening at 8, when Lorelei posted a 6-paragraph statement to her HOA Facebook group, titled, "Standing Strong Against Outside Influences." The statement, without naming anyone, accused certain adjacent landowners of manufacturing politically motivated investigations to delay legitimate community development. It urged Heritage Hills residents to stand together against those who would weaponize the regulatory state against working families. A Heritage Hills resident screenshotted the post and emailed it to me at 9:15 Saturday night. I forwarded it to Hyacinth Ostrander at the AG's office at 9:16. She replied at 9:20. "That's witness intimidation under KSA 21-5909, adding it to the manifest." I went to bed at 10. Buster slept under the table. The wind picked up at midnight. The Storm Prediction Center upgraded the Marshall County risk zone to 10% hatched at midnight 30. By Sunday morning at 7, the Storm Prediction Center had issued a particularly dangerous situation discussion for the eastern third of Kansas. Wichita's National Weather Service office had begun activating their emergency tornado response protocols. Holton arrived at the farmhouse at 11:15, with brother Jonas Stutzman from the Mennonite Disaster Service local chapter. Jonas was 61. He had responded to 43 Kansas tornado deployments in his career. He knew the look of a sky that meant business. He stood on my porch at 11:30 and looked west. The sky was the color of old denim, with a hard edge of cream at the horizon. He said, "Magnus, this is going to be a night." The Storm Prediction Center issued the particularly dangerous situation tornado watch at 12:45. We pulled the tractors into the barn at 1. We checked the root cellar at 1:30. The wind was already at 25 miles per hour. By 2, the tornado siren testing system had been activated by the Marshall County Emergency Manager. By 3, every weather radio in the county was running NOA, a continuous transmission. By 3:40, my grandfather Eric's 7-row shelter belt was standing in a 35-mile-per-hour westerly wind that had not yet brought rain. The tornado touched down at 4:47 Sunday afternoon at the east edge of Marysville, 3 miles southwest of my farm. It started as an EF1, winds of 110 miles per hour, a debris cloud the size of a barn. It crossed Highway 36 at 4:53. It crossed the Big Blue River at 4:57. It crossed open agricultural ground for the next 6 minutes, picking up speed and intensifying. By the time it reached the western boundary of Heritage Hills at Marysville at 5:09 in the evening, it was an EF3 with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour and a debris cloud half a mile wide. I was in the root cellar with Holton, brother Jonas, and Buster. The cellar was 30 inches of brick below ground. My grandfather had built it for exactly this situation in 1939. We had a battery-powered NOAA weather radio running continuously. We had a hand-cranked LED lantern. We had a wool blanket my mother Greta had crocheted in 1973. We could feel the tornado before we could hear it. The cellar walls pressed inward. The brick popped at 6 separate points along the eastern wall. The pressure differential dropped 4 millibars in 11 seconds. Holton, who knew his weather instruments better than most TV meteorologists, called it out as we sat against the western wall. The wool blanket pulled toward the eastern wall as the air evacuated. Above us, the tornado crossed Heritage Hills at Marysville. I would learn later, from television footage and from the National Weather Service damage survey, that the tornado entered the development from the west at Lot 73. It crossed the community pool in 8 seconds. It hit the highest concentration of homes between lots 41 and 92 at peak intensity. It removed roofs, walls, and slabs from 27 homes. It rolled 6 SUVs into a single pile at the bottom of the development's main entrance road. It tore Lorelei Brindle's pearl-white Lincoln Navigator off its tires and threw it 63 yards east into what had been the foundation of her own kitchen. The development was destroyed in approximately 4 minutes. At 5:11, the tornado hit my shelter belt. My grandfather Eric had designed the western face for exactly this moment. He had planted Osage orange as the windward row because Osage orange has the densest wood of any North American tree species, and because its thorny branches catch debris before the debris reaches the inner rows. He had planted black walnut behind the Osage orange because black walnut grows tall and straight and breaks high before it breaks at the trunk. He had planted bur oak behind the black walnut because bur oak has the deepest taproot system of any plains hardwood, and because mature bur oaks have survived every tornado that has crossed Kansas since the Spanish first put the prairie on a map. He had planted eastern red cedar as the leeward face, because red cedar gives the wind something soft to lean against after the hardwoods have done the structural work. The tornado hit the Osage orange row at 5:11. The Osage orange row absorbed the leading edge of the wind shear. The black walnut row lost 14 trees out of 41. The bur oaks lost 2 crowns out of 36. The eastern red cedars bent and held. By 5:15 and 20 seconds, the tornado had passed over the shelter belt and dissipated to EF1 intensity as it crossed my farmstead. The farmhouse lost 1 downspout, 3 shingles from the kitchen roof, and a screen door from the back porch. The barn lost 6 shingles and a hand-painted sign that had been bolted to the south wall since 1962. The chicken coop lost its weather vane. The shelter belt, my grandfather's shelter belt, lost approximately 14 trees out of 280. It still stood. By 5:16, the tornado was a quarter-mile east of my property and dropping. By 5:18, the National Weather Service Wichita office downgraded the storm to a severe thunderstorm. By 5:20, the rain started. We came out of the cellar at 5:43. I stood on the porch with Holton and Brother Jonas and Buster. The rain was steady. The light was gray. The shelter belt was wet and dripping. The black walnut row had lost branches, but no full trees that were visible from the porch. To the west, where Heritage Hills at Marysville had been at 4 o'clock that afternoon, there was a 1-mile-wide field of splintered lumber, broken sheetrock, twisted vinyl siding, and a single overturned Lincoln Navigator with a vanity plate that read LORALEI. I could see it from the porch through the gap in my grandfather's bur oak row. Brother Jonas crossed himself. He said, "Magnus, we need to walk over there." I told him yes. Holton picked up the emergency radio Sheriff Goheen had loaned us Saturday afternoon. He keyed it on. He said, "Sheriff, we're walking the section line to Heritage Hills. Send any units you have to the development. There are going to be people trapped." Sheriff Goheen came back in 3 seconds. He said, "Already on the way. Magnus, you stay safe." We walked west. The rain fell on a quarter-mile of intact prairie shelter belt between my porch and what had once been Lorelei Brindle's house. We reached the western boundary of my shelter belt at 6:07. The section line fence was down for half a mile. The McKinley quarter section that had become Heritage Hills at Marysville in 1998 was a debris field of unrecognizable building materials. The pool's filtration shed had been thrown 100 yards east. The community kayak rack, which I had never understood the purpose of in central Kansas, was lying broken in 3 pieces in the alfalfa field along the southern boundary. Lorelei Brindle was alive. She was buried under what used to be the front wall of her dining room. Her left leg was pinned beneath a section of granite countertop. Her face was bleeding from a cut above her left eye. She was conscious. Brother Jonas reached her first. He had spent 28 years pulling Kansas neighbors out of tornado debris. He knew exactly how to extract her without making the injury worse. Holton ran back to the farmhouse for the emergency medical kit and the come-along winch I keep in the barn. I knelt beside Lorelei in the rain. She looked at me. She did not say anything. The cut above her eye was bleeding into her left ear. I said, "Mrs. Brindle, my nephew is bringing the equipment. We're going to get you out. Try not to move." She nodded. She closed her eyes. We extracted Lorelei Brindle from beneath her own granite countertop at 6:34. Marshall County Emergency Medical Services arrived at 6:41. Sheriff Goheen was the third person on scene. The 1st State Highway Patrol Unit arrived at 7:12. By 7:30, search and rescue had recovered 19 residents from the Heritage Hills debris field. 3 were transported to Hanover Hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. None of the residents had been killed. Brother Jonas told me later that this was a statistical anomaly. An EF3 tornado crossing a 140-home wood-frame subdivision without basements typically produces between 2 and 7 fatalities. Heritage Hills had produced 0. The reason was simple. Sheriff Goheen had ordered an early evacuation alert at 1 in the afternoon when the SPC issued the particularly dangerous situation discussion. Most Heritage Hills residents had relocated to the high school storm shelter in Marysville by 3. Lorelei Brindle had refused to leave her own home. She had been the only resident on her block when the tornado hit. By Monday morning at 6, KSN News had 4 vehicles in the McKinley quarter section. The reporter was a 38-year-old woman named Bryony Mitchell. She had been on the desk for 9 years. She had covered the Greensburg EF5 in 2007. She walked the western boundary of my property at 7 Monday morning with a cameraman. She framed the shot with the intact shelter belt in the foreground and the obliterated Heritage Hills development behind it. She turned on the camera at 7:05. She said, "Mr. Vesterholt, your block is the only block standing for half a mile in any direction. Can you explain what we are looking at?" I held up a black and white photograph I had brought down from the roll-top desk that morning. The photograph was 8 by 10. It showed my grandfather, Eric Vesterholt, standing in front of a row of Osage orange saplings in the spring of 1937, holding a shovel, in the company of 7 WPA workers. The handwritten caption on the back read, "Prairie States Forestry Project, Vesterholt Quarter, Marshall County, May 14, 1937. I held the photograph where the camera could see it. I said, "My grandfather Eric Westerholt planted 7 rows of trees on this quarter section with a Works Progress Administration crew on May 14th of 1937. The Prairie States Forestry Project was a federal program established by President Roosevelt to protect plains farms from Dust Bowl winds. The trees were chosen for density, taproot depth, debris catch capacity, and survival in Kansas climate. They have been doing the job they were planted to do for 88 years. I lowered the photograph. The camera held on the shelter belt. I said, "The HOA across the section line called these trees ugly in 19 separate letters between 1998 and the day before the tornado. Mrs. Brindle is in Hanover Hospital this morning because the trees did exactly what my grandfather planted them to do. Mrs. Brindle's neighbors are alive because Sheriff Goheen ordered an early evacuation. The shelter belt is the reason Mrs. Brindle's house is the only one in Heritage Hills that did not collapse cleanly to its foundation. The structural wall slowed the wind by enough that a person trapped inside could be rescued instead of crushed." I paused. "I would like, when she recovers, to invite Mrs. Brindle to walk the shelter belt with me. The trees do not hold grudges." I handed the photograph to Bryony Mitchell. She held it up to the camera one final time. The Marshall County Planning Commission meeting on the Phase 2 rezoning was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7. Kansas Attorney General Investigator Hyacinth Ostrander attended. She filed the formal indictment against Talbert Brindle, Lorelei Brindle, and Brindle Heartland Holdings LLC at the close of the public comment period. The federal grand jury returned a sealed indictment under federal RICO statutes the following Monday. By the end of the week, 27 shelter belt removal cases across northeast Kansas had been reopened for civil and criminal review. Talbert Brindle pleaded guilty in October to RICO racketeering, wire fraud, federal insurance fraud, and conspiracy. 11 years federal at FCI Leavenworth. $7.4 million in restitution. Lorelei Brindle pleaded guilty in December to conspiracy, accessory to fraud, witness intimidation under KSA 21-5909, and 1 count of filing false administrative claims under color of HOA authority. 3 years state prison at the Topeka Correctional Facility, 1 year before parole eligibility. Twyla Crockett, Thalia's daughter, the regional listing agent for distressed properties, pleaded guilty in February to real estate fraud, 18 months state prison. Brindle Heartland Holdings LLC was dissolved by court order. The 7,400 acres the LLC had assembled across 4 counties were distributed by Kansas court receivers. 11 of the parcels were returned to their prior owners or their heirs at no cost. 16 were sold at fair market value, with the proceeds distributed pro rata to the original sellers as restitution. Heritage Hills at Marysville was rebuilt over the following 16 months. The new development bylaws, drafted by a reconstituted HOA board chaired by Adeline Krause, the 78-year-old shelter belt removal victim who had testified at the Planning Commission, required every rebuilt home to plant a 6-row shelter belt on its western boundary. The new HOA hired Kansas State University Extension to design the plantings. 41 species of native plains tree were planted. The first saplings went in the ground in October of 2025. Lorelei Brindle was released from Hanover Hospital after 18 days. She had a fractured left tibia and a 4-inch scar above her left eye. She spent 6 months in physical therapy. She moved out of the rebuilt Heritage Hills before her sentence began. She walked my shelter belt with me on a Saturday morning in late September. She did not speak much. She put her hand on the trunk of the eastern Osage orange tree, where my grandfather's photograph had been taken in 1937. She did not say what she was thinking. I did not ask. She thanked me for the rescue. I told her my grandfather's trees had rescued her. She walked back to her rental car in town. I established the Eric Westerholt Memorial Shelter Belt Restoration Initiative in May of 2025, with my nephew Holton serving as the program coordinator. The initiative provides matching grants and species selection guidance to Kansas farmsteads that lost shelter belts to the Brindle scheme. The first 100 shelter belt plantings funded by the initiative went in the ground in November of 2025. Dr. Cyril Yount at the USDA Manhattan Plant Materials Center designed every planting. Brother Jonas Stutzman and the Mennonite Disaster Service local chapter coordinated the volunteer labor. Sheriff Bowen Goheen donated a county dump truck and 3 deputies for the first weekend of plantings. The trees planted in November of 2025 will protect Kansas farmsteads from wind in 2113. Holton moved back to the farmhouse in June. He kept his USDA grain inspector job, but transferred to the Marysville field office. He bought a 1968 Alice Chalmers tractor at the Marshall County Threshing Bee auction in August, and started restoring it in the barn evenings. Buster, the 15-year-old border collie, made it through one more Kansas winter. He passed on a Tuesday morning in February of 2026. Holton and I buried him under the bur oak row of the shelter belt. His grave is marked with a piece of black walnut Holton turned on the lathe in the barn. Last night, Holton and I drove the F-250 down to a diner in Marysville called the Wagon Wheel. We ate chicken fried steak and pinto beans at the counter, under a ceiling fan that had been there since 1962. The jukebox played Hank Williams. We drove home with the windows down. The Kansas summer night was warm. The Big Blue River was running cool. A great horned owl crossed the road in front of our headlights and disappeared into a stand of black walnut my grandfather would have recognized. I'm Magnus Vesterholt. That was my grandfather's shelter belt. That was my brother's son. That was my dog. That was the wall that held.
Lorelei Brindle didn't fall because Magnus Vesterholt got loud. She fell because Magnus Vesterholt let the trees do what they had been planted to do. For 27 years, across 2 consecutive HOA presidents and 1 family-owned developer, the Heritage Hills at Maryville HOA has been mocking, fining, and lobbying for the removal of an 88-year-old federal saddle belt planted by his grandfather under the Prairie State Forestry Project. Not once in those 27 years did anyone behind the mockery stop to ask the basic question: what was the world planted to do? That's the lesson. A scheme survives on the assumption that's the condition that's caused the original protections will never return. Real strength is knowing that on the plans, the conditions always return. Magnus didn't beat her with anger. He beat her with patience. He kept every letter for 27 years. He called his nephew. He called the Attorney General. He let his grandfather's 1937 trees show the taste of Kansas what they had been planted to do. If you ever had an HOA mock something your family planted, drop your story in the comments. We hear each other. Hit subscribe. Next week, we have to Coastal Maine, where an HOA tried to bulldoze a man's family lobster pond. Turns out, the lobster man's grandfather wrote the state harbor master regulations.